Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm John Dickerson. We're joined by our panel, the Washington Post's legendary Bob Woodward, who needs no introduction. Mark Halperin is managing editor of Bloomberg Politics. Nancy Cordes is our CBS News congressional correspondent. And Jeffrey Goldberg is the national correspondent for The Atlantic. Bob, I want to start with you. You've seen a few committees. What do you make of the Benghazi committee and this hearing this Thursday?
Well, the successful congressional investigations eventually become bipartisan. The Senate Watergate Committee was set up by a vote in the Senate 77-0. Dozens of Republicans saying, yeah, we need to look at this. And now we've got a fractured committee. And so you wind up getting fractured partisan data.
Yeah. You take the fact that it's not been bipartisan, the fact that Congressman McCarthy said what he said, that Hillary Clinton's on the offense, and that Chairman Gowdy showed this morning that he does not know how to frame for the public broad questions. What did the president know and when did he know it? Something that will break through. So I think Hillary Clinton is set up to be as strong and as powerful in this hearing, unless Chairman Gowdy is sitting on some secret than anyone could have imagined.
You know, Jeffrey, Mark makes a good point about this goes down the rabbit hole very quickly. Right. And also when you get charge and countercharge and a series of names people don't know. Take us back to 30,000 feet. What's the big question being missed here about U.S. policy? And
well, they're having a hearing about the wrong subject as it relates to Libya. The question facing America is not what happened that night in Benghazi. Those are important questions, and we have to have better diplomatic security, quite obviously. But the question for Hillary Clinton going into this race is, why did you support a Libya intervention that has failed? I mean, in the debate, she owned the intervention. She said it was the right thing to do. Libya is in a state of failure. And that should be what we're debating. The role of intervention, the role the U.S. should be playing in the Middle East in these disintegrating states. And so I think everything is being missed, actually.
Yeah, and the role of what you do after you come in.
Well, that's the key. This was a halfway intervention, and so what's going to be interesting when you go into the general, if she goes into the general, is she going to have to distance herself from President Obama's reluctance to actually fully commit in Libya?
Nancy, what do you make of the Clinton posture going into this? What's their feeling about this?
Well, she's definitely got some wind in her sails, not only because of her strong debate performance, but also because of the gifts that you talked about with your previous guests, with Kevin McCarthy, with Richard Hanna saying that, or at least admitting that this is partly political. The challenge for her is going to be that Chairman Gowdy has said he wants to do 4 rounds of questioning, 10 minutes per questioner. Now, math was never my strongest subject, but with 12 members of the committee, we're looking at 8 hours before you even work in lunch, votes, breaks, and it's very hard, even if you're the most disciplined person testifying, not to have a single moment where you say something that you wish you didn't, especially when you're in hour 7 or hour 8.
She's going to have to bring a sleeping bag. Let's pivot to Joe Biden and the speculation about him. Bob, what does your gut tell you about Joe Biden?
I think when we know actually what happens when he announces his decision, we're going to find out that he's decided both ways. I know for a fact months ago he told somebody very, very close to him that he had decided to run. I think what's happened is then he's undecided to run and maybe decided again, and so we're in this never land. And this, when you peel back decision making, you find that it goes up and down this way and that way. Where it's going to land, probably he won't, but surprise maybe.
In the calls I've been making, people who've had a view along the way have now reached the heck if I know stage. Mark, I want to ask you about, there's a Suffolk University poll about New Hampshire in which Democrats were asked, do you want Joe Biden to run? 50% said they did not want him to run. Only 36 said they did want him to run. What's your sense of the politics of that?
I think that the static analysis would tell you that if he got in now, it's too late. There's no way to overcome the poll deficits, the fundraising deficits, the organization deficits. My sense is, from talking to people, the vice president's not looking at this as a static thing, nor is he afraid to end his career with what some would say is a humiliating loss, nor is he moved by Hillary Clinton getting good reviews in the debate or what happens Thursday. If he runs, he will try to run as an incumbent vice president saying, I'm part of an administration, you liked Democrats, I can do better, I can win a general election, and I can talk about economics, middle class, working class economics. I think in the end, he, according to people who've talked to him of late, he is as sharp and as focused and as over his grief as he has been since Bo died, but not all of them are sure he's all the way there.
Nancy, I was struck that John Podesta, the top person in the Hillary Clinton campaign, said in, I think it was the New York Times, he said Joe Biden needs to kind of make a decision, which felt like a movement from where the Clinton campaign had been, which is let Joe make his decision. We're not going to weigh in. What did you make of that?
I think they're absolutely trying to put pressure on Joe Biden, and people who I've spoken to in his inner circle say he doesn't care. He is happy to wait. He's willing to withstand the slings and arrows, not just from the Clinton camp, but others in the Democratic Party who say he needs to get off the fence. He's comfortable waiting if he thinks that that's the best thing for him. Someone else very close to him told me that he has always had a saying that in politics, either you are on your way up or you are on your way down. And even if he's leaning against a run, he knows that the minute he says he's not running, he's on the way down. He's a lame duck vice president who is probably leaving office for good in a year. And that's something that's difficult to say for someone who spent more than half their life in elective politics.
Bob, I want to ask you the question I asked David Axelrod. Is Bernie Sanders' argument is he's going to create a revolution, and that's going to put pressure on Congress. Given how polarized things are now, what's your sense of what chances are that that would work?
I think if you really look at what voters are thinking, they want not a revolution, but some sort of peace, and let's do away with a lot of the slings and arrows that are flying around. So my guess, and it's a guess, but it's about most likely outcome, that the Democrats are going to find a progressive candidate, not a revolutionary or radical one, and the Republicans are going to find the person who most resembles Ronald Reagan. Somebody, I mean, this is the new hero in the Republican Party, and if anybody can stand up convincingly and say, I'm most like Ronald Reagan, that may be the nominee.
Just a very quick point on Bernie Sanders. Hope and change turned out to be harder to sell than people thought. Despair and change is probably going to be harder to sell than that, I think. And so there's a top line here that you can't cross.
If he wins the nomination and wins the general election, there will be a revolution. He will sweep the Democrats in control of the Senate. I think he could well turn the House, because he will have such coattails if the voters turn out to vote for Bernie Sanders. So I think he's absolutely right that he would have a mandate to do lots of the things he's talking about. Difficult to get there, but if he got there,
how
I think
difficult?
He's
right.
I don't think
almost impossible.
I think we're talking about a level of difficulty.
Very, very difficult. But I don't think we should be so cynical as to say that if he found a following, if he got the American people to elect him president of the United States, that he wouldn't then have a mandate to make the kind of fundamental changes he wants to make. I agree, he's a long shot to do both those things.
But if he got there,
yes,
that would be the follow-on.
He would have
quickly,
coattails
Nancy.
like you've never seen before.
And in his defense, he's not saying he is going to start a revolution. He's saying that he needs a revolution because he knows that the things he wants to do are going to be impossible to do given this Congress otherwise.
All right. That's it for now. We'll be right back with our panel in a moment. Stay with us. And we're back. Jeffrey, I want to talk about the Republican side of the race. Donald Trump and Jeb Bush are now in a fight over George W. Bush's legacy. On
Such a useful fight, right?
Yeah. What do you make of that?
Well, well, I mean, as you pointed out, it's quite an interesting moment. Jeb is tying himself to his brother, which might work in the primaries, but if he gets to the general, I think that's death. That doesn't do very much for him. But this issue that Trump is centered on has come to, the 9/11 issue, is such an interesting one because there are a lot of things you could blame George W. Bush for. Right, but 9/11 is slightly lower down on the list. The guy was president for 8 months, and when this happened, and if you look, one of the critiques Trump has of Bush is that his immigration policies led to this. Now, the 9/11 hijackers were in America before George W. Bush was president, so that's a bit of a stretch.
Donald Trump making a stretch.
Bush is in a fight with Marco Rubio to be the establishment alternative to Trump. The establishment assumes someday there will be such a thing and that person will end up being the nominee. He's chosen to open another front in his war against Trump because in the Bush world, they believe in the end, why will Trump fall? They believe because voters will say he's not a credible commander-in-chief. Trump opened the door to that attack. It's dangerous for Bush. First of all, fighting a two-front war is hard. And second, he's fought Trump before on these type of issues, and it's not helped him.
And his most animated moments are in defense of his brother, which creates that lock. Yeah. Bob, I want to ask you about, Jeb Bush has tried to get out from under his brother, but This is history. I mean, George Bush was the president when a tragedy happened in America and 2 wars resulted afterwards. I mean, isn't it kind of crazy to think that anybody can get out from a president who presided over such historic times?
Well, I wrote 4 books about Bush's wars, and some of it worked, some of it definitely did not work, like the Iraq War. And but Jeffrey's right. Refighting this, I mean, it doesn't work. This is not on people's minds. They want to know: are we going to be safe now? Not whether we were or weren't in the past. And I think again, the Republican Party there's a certain gravitational pull that develops, and it is, let's do something sensible. We want to win the presidency, and the polling and common sense will take you away from Trump getting the nomination. And I think it will, as I was saying, who can stand up and say, I'm like Ronald Reagan, not Donald Trump.
Just a very quick point on something that Bob said. It's another example. This is another example of fighting about the wrong subject. In Libya, where we should be discussing the role of interventionism, right? When it comes to 9/11, we should be talking about what do we do to defend ourselves from terrorists without hurting or damaging the Constitution, for instance. And this fight is just a rehash of something that happened. We're not going to fix it by talking about it over and over again.
Mark, we had some fundraising numbers out this week. What do you make of those numbers? Who's any dark horses coming out with a lot of money? And
well, we don't see the super PAC numbers because we don't get those till later, and I think Ted Cruz is probably still doing well there. The fight over who's got 12 million versus 10 million versus 20 million even does not matter. Presidential politics is about earned media. Donald Trump is showing that getting on the news, driving your message personally, being a good candidate matters so much more than raising money for television ads. So I think it's all a bit silly, and the focus on it is a bit silly. Jeb Bush says the ads are going to save him. That's what's going to bring him back. No candidate can be revived with ads. It's got to be speaking to the aspirations of the American people.
But what it has become is sort of a proxy for this fight that we talked about earlier between Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush. They're fighting over who raised more money, and I got 0.3 more than you. No, you didn't, because they both want to try and show they're in the strongest position so that if voters do turn away from Donald Trump and Ben Carson, they seem like the obvious choice.
But no one, Bob, has ever lit the fire of the American imagination talking about dollars and cents of money raised, right?
Yes, that's true. And then when you start doing that, as is well documented under the follow the money rule, it's corrupt. Yeah. It's a process that does, and this is one of the things I think Bernie Sanders in the Democratic debate made a really good point about. People are being bought and sold.
One last question to you, Nancy, before we leave is Paul Ryan, the question for who's going to be the Speaker of the House. Where does that stand before Republicans come back to town?
Well, there is some news on that front, and that is that after weeks, if not years, of saying no way, no how, Paul Ryan is now telling those close to him that he is open to running for Speaker. But there is a big caveat, which is that he's not going to campaign for the support of these 40 or so very conservative members of the House Freedom Caucus. He says he's got a record of conservative leadership. Either they believe in that record or they don't. The problem is they're looking for very significant concessions in exchange for their support. They want new rules, for example. He says if he doesn't get the sense that they're going to be behind him, he'll stay where he is as the chair of Ways and Means, which is someplace he was very happy with.
They've got to come to him, and there's no real other alternative. Thank you all for joining me today. We'll be right back with a look at a key player in the Nixon White House and the Watergate investigation. Stay with us. For those of you who don't know the name Alexander Butterfield, watch this.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
That was in July of 1973 in the Senate Watergate hearings. That's Butterfield exposing publicly for the first time the existence of the secret White House taping system that would ultimately bring down President Nixon. It was a bombshell. Butterfield is the subject of a new book, The Last of the President's Men, by none other than famed Washington Post reporter Bob Woodward. And Bob is back with us now. Bob, that pause between Fred Thompson's question and Butterfield's answer, it seems like a whole lifetime in there. Why was his admission about the taping system so important?
Well, because it was Nixon's biggest secret. In fact, Nixon thought it would never be revealed. And of course, the tapes were, the Supreme Court said they had to be turned over to the prosecutors and investigators, and they provided the evidence that forced Nixon to resign. And Nixon was forced to resign, when you really look at it, by the Republicans, who were, as Barry Goldwater once told Carl Bernstein and myself, too many lies, too many crimes. And that's what it was.
Alexander Butterfield was in the tight circle that knew these tapes existed. Kissinger didn't even know, right, that the recordings existed. Right. And so he knew that it would nail the president. Why did he give them up?
Well, there's a long section in the book about this odyssey he took, and his ex-wife thinks he wanted to tell. Butterfield kind of denies that and then says, well, subconsciously, maybe I did. But, ultimately in our business, we try to figure out why people do things. And this finally, I think, gets to the answer. But you see that this is a story about power. This is about Nixon's power, and Butterfield, who had that place, the office right next to the Oval Office for 3 years, was witnessed, front row seat. And when I started talking to Butterfield, and realized that he had thousands of documents, some originals that he had taken out of the White House, some of this stuff, for somebody who spent years looking at Nixon, is shocking.
Well, that's what's so amazing about this book, because you think, Nixon, it's been covered, Watergate, and yet you found someone who was taking careful notes and writing his own even story about the period before the tapes exist. So this is a window, and he was a bit of a pack rat. I mean, he had everything, right?
Yes, he did. Well, I mean, he had lots, but the real question here is the management of the Vietnam War. I mean, war is the index for, it tells us who we are to the world and to ourselves, and the Vietnam War still casts this giant shadow over the country, and it should. And what happened in the Vietnam War, and there's this new memo, the Zilch memo, which was buried and no one had ever seen it. I talked to people about it, oh no, it doesn't exist, and so forth, and there it is. And
tell us what the Zilch memo is.
Yes, right. It's Nixon in his own handwriting in early '72, when he's starting to run for re-election, saying that the bombing, 3 years of bombing which he'd ordered and supervised, accomplished zilch, nothing, and it was a total failure. And of course, this contradicts 3 years of pronouncements about the importance of the bombing. The night before he wrote that, he told CBS News, Dan Rather, that it was very, very effective. And so it's a lie, and it is a really significant lie, because then that year Nixon increased and intensified the bombing, and there are tapes and documents that show that it really was done because bombing was popular, according to the polling, and Nixon wanted to win re-election. And there's some hair-raising conversations about this. So you find the bombing was not to win the war, but to win re-election.
Yeah, in Nixon's own handwriting, basically saying, and he was pushing Kissinger to try and find some other new method that would be more effective.
Oh, and he wanted to study, and I asked Kissinger, and he said he doesn't remember the specific memo. He said that Nixon was frequently asking, he said, I'll show you 50 memos where Nixon asked for more bombing. And there is a social, I was in the Navy in the late 60s and served on a ship off the coast of Vietnam. There is a social contract between the commander-in-chief and everyone in the military. You do your job, I'll do my job. And the job of the commander-in-chief is to protect the military if we're engaged in wars, to try to win the war, not to use the means of dropping millions of tons of bombs to win re-election. I mean, that is monstrous behavior. It is, if there was a memo now that Barack Obama, who's doing all these drone strikes, where he said, well, we've done all these drone strikes for years, we've achieved zilch, and it's a failure, and that became public, people, I mean, he might be finished.
Yeah. That is the big monstrous behavior. What your book also categorizes or details, and Butterfield details, is the small ways in which Nixon was just a very strange character. Tell us about when Butterfield first comes into the job. Haldeman is his boss, and he won't introduce Butterfield to Nixon. Why?
Well, because it has to be done at the right time. There has to be a briefing memo on it, and it turned out he had to do it at a moment that was not planned, and so Nixon didn't know it was going to happen, and there was no talking point. You know, now this new Deputy Chief of Staff is going to be here, and Nixon couldn't talk. And there is incident after incident where you see Nixon lonely, haunted by the past. You know, every little slight seems to be remembered. When he was on Wall Street as an attorney for being, after being vice president for 8 years, he rants and raves about those people who were my law partners, the SOBs. Did one of them ever invite me to his country club to play golf? Did he ever invite me to? And you know, this Nixon, unfortunately for him and for the country, never relaxed. He never sensed, gee, you're president, there's some goodwill out there, even among Democrats, because they want you to succeed. And so it was always this war. And so he was haunted by JFK, John F. Kennedy pictures that were discovered in the staff offices, and just went nuts about it, called it an infestation. And Butterfield had to conduct an investigation, and he wrote Nixon a memo, subject sanitization of the EOB staff offices.
All right, Bob Woodward, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you. A fascinating book. We'll be right back. Before we go, we have a quick programming note. On Thursday, you can watch all of Hillary Clinton's testimony to the House Benghazi Committee starting at 10 a.m. Eastern, live on our digital outlet, CBSN. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.